Hey folks, and welcome into episode 21 of the Longhorn Mailbag. Thanks for being here with us on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. We're answering your questions from horns247.com. No true false yet this week. We're getting closer though. Let's go ahead and jump right into the two very loaded questions that we've got today. First up, from 2300, your guesstimate on how big Texas's recruiting class is versus how many Texas takes in the portal. All right, so let's start with some context. At the time of this recording, Texas's 2024 class holds 22 commitments from the high school ranks, and they've got 2 commitments in the transfer portal ranks. I say at the time of this recording because between now and when this is uploaded, and when you see it, of course, 8 million different things can happen. So that's from right now. Let's go ahead and start with the high school ranks. I think the Longhorns probably end up around the 24, 25 range in the 2024 class. I don't particularly see any drama happening with the current Texas commits when it comes to them maybe looking at other schools, flipping elsewhere, etc. Hank and Jordan and I talked about that yesterday in the signing day preview. But I do think that Steve Sarkisian and his staff still kind of have that grill on, and they're looking to use the spatula to flip a couple of guys here late. When I think of specific names, I look at the guys that Hank and Jordan have been reporting on for quite some time over at horns247.com. First up, current Texas A&M linebacker commit Ty Anthony Smith. I think this is a guy that Texas really wants. They've been on him for a very long time. And then you look at Baylor defensive lineman commit Alex Foster, too, who just came in for an official visit weekend and said it went really well. We'll start off with Smith. He's a guy that, like I said, Texas has targeted for a while. He's been committed to the Aggies since late June. It's been a roller coaster in College Station since then. So you can kind of understand why Smith would maybe be looking elsewhere. They got the new coach at Mike Elko. Horns 24/7 reported that if he was in town for a visit this past weekend, odds were that he would flip to Texas, and he was in town for a visit this weekend. So the crystal ball now favors Texas. He's still committed to the Aggies. There's no word yet if he's going to flip, but that's certainly something that seems imminent, if anything. Now, Foster is another guy who visited this past weekend, and he talked to Horns 24/7 afterwards and said, quote, Texas's chances are high right now. Well, you can't really ask for much more there. So he's a guy that's been committed to Baylor since July and would be another welcome addition to the 2024 class that already has some talented defensive linemen in it. And speaking of defensive linemen, who says there isn't room for one more? How about Steve Wiltfong last night mentioning that 5-star Texas A&M defensive lineman commit Dominic McKinley, who said he was taking his signing decision into February, has a chance to maybe sign on early signing day on Wednesday. And, if he did, Texas and LSU would be the 2 teams to watch for. Now, there's no word for sure on if that is actually going to happen. It's just more something to monitor, if anything. And still unclear whether or not Texas has a chance in that recruitment. But he was a guy that Hank South was really high on and said would end up at Texas earlier on in this recruiting process. Obviously, things have changed since then. Things can still change here, but it's still something to keep an eye on going forward. So that covers the high school ranks. Now in the transfer portal, it's kind of hit a wait and see point now with the dead period, which prohibits portal prospects from taking visits to schools until January. But the 2 guys that they do have right now are fantastic additions in Matthew Golden and Andrew Makuba. I've been high on Matthew Golden since his high school days, playing at Klein Kane in the Houston area. And when he's had a chance to prove himself, he has the last 2 years at Houston. And in the return game, he's been phenomenal as well. He had 2 special teams touchdowns this year for the Cougars, so I'm sure he'll bring that same pedigree and special teams to Austin if Steve Sarkisian wants to use him there. And then Andrew Makuba yesterday was a much-needed addition to the secondary that's not very deep this year, but next year is bringing in not just Makuba, but like Hank and Jordan and I talked about yesterday in the early signing day preview, arguably, if not the best defensive back class in America in the 2024 group. They got Xavier Filsabe to commit yesterday. They've got Kobe Black a couple weeks ago and Jordan Johnson-Rebel. The list goes on and on and on. But it looks like the defensive backfield for Texas is going to be solid going forward with guys on the roster too, with Derek Williams, Terrence Brooks, Malik Muhammad. I could go on and on about that. So when it comes now to who is left on the board, the big name and the big name that we've been reporting for quite some time is UTSA edge Trey Moore. And I still like Texas's chances with him. He went to Alabama for a visit last week. But I still think the Longhorns consider one or two more players, maybe some guys that aren't in the portal yet, which obviously can't be discussed. Maybe a second wide receiver, an interior defensive lineman. We'll kind of see, and it just depends on who goes into the portal and who doesn't. So for the transfer portal, I would say right around 4 or 5 takes is where I see the Longhorns going in that department. All right, on our second and final question of today's episode from Fazzy Wazzy. Who do you see as the biggest X factor in the Sugar Bowl? Well, Fazzy Wazzy, I'm not going to pin this down on one player, and instead I'm going to do it on an entire group, and that is the Texas secondary, and maybe more specifically, the Texas safety room. Without a shadow of a doubt, they're the biggest X factor because Washington has the number one passing offense in America. They've got Michael Penix Jr., a Heisman finalist quarterback. They've got 3 NFL caliber wide receivers. And Texas has the number 94 pass defense in the country when it comes to yards per game allowed in the passing game. So it's just simply not a good matchup for Texas. So that's why this secondary and really the safeties, like I mentioned, is going to have to step it up. And that's the X factor because two things can happen if they play good and if they don't. So let's go ahead and start with the good news for Texas fans. If they're able to slow down the offensive machine that Washington has been through the air, I very much trust the Texas run defense to be able to stop Dylan Johnson and limit Dylan Johnson. He's been on fire all year, but Texas has played several running backs who have been on fire all year, and they've extinguished all of them so far this season. I also trust the Texas offense to be able to capitalize enough offensively against Washington, who has a number 91 ranked total defense, and I think their red zone defense is even lower in the 100s, and be able to put up enough points on the board to go and get a lead. So there's your positive scenario. The Texas secondary steps it up and is able to limit, because I don't think they can stop, but I think they can limit the Washington aerial attack. Now, if Texas's secondary can't find an answer for the Washington aerial attack, and Michael Penix is just throwing all over him, Rome Odunze is getting behind everybody and scoring touchdowns, then this game obviously gets 3 times as difficult for Texas to win because it potentially is a shootout between these two teams. And Texas has not been in a lot of offensive shootouts so far this season. I would still favor Texas in this scenario because I think they have the better defense, but that may not matter if it ends up being a game similar to Red River shootout this year when Oklahoma gets the ball last after Texas makes the go-ahead field goal and just marches down the field for a game-winning touchdown in the corner of the end zone, because it's going to be hard to bet against the Huskies in that instance if they're down by less than 7. So all in all, this game really comes down to how well the secondary plays for me. If they slow it down enough and they're able to get just a few stops, it doesn't need to be, 6, 7 stops. It only needs to be, 2 or 3 maybe, depending on how the Texas offense plays. Then Texas can win this game and Texas can go to the national championship. But if not, then it's going to be hard to get more points potentially than the Washington offense, or if just keep the ball away from Washington at the end. The big thing is if it's a close game, Quinn Ewers needs to have the ball last. Texas needs to have the ball last. They can't give Washington a chance to move the ball downfield on Texas late game scenario because the Longhorns have struggled in that situation. So that really to me is going to be the difference on whether or not the Longhorns are playing at NRG Stadium on January 8th for a national championship. And so that's going to do it for this episode of the Longhorn Mailbag. I want to thank you so much for being here with us on the Horns 24/7 YouTube channel. And while you're around, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications so you're the first to know when new content heads your way. For the rest of the crew, I'm Tommy Yarrish. Thanks for being here again, and we'll see you next time.